Welcome back, everybody, to Epic Voyages Radio, online here at InceptionRadioNetwork.com. I am your host this evening, Laurel Blythe Tague. I'm the Vice President and New York State Director for Epic Voyagers. And check out our website at epicvoyagers.com. We have a YouTube channel with several hundred hours of presentations there and some of our archive shows going back for many years. And, of course, Inception Radio Network always keeps our archived webcasts here. I think they go back to June of 2011. So all you have to do is go to Inception Radio Network, go to shows, go to archives, click on our icon there for Epic Voyages Radio, and take your pick. So we're getting pretty close to the end of the year here, and what we've got tonight for a show, back in April, I interviewed Mike Campbell, the author of Amelia Earhart, The Truth at Last, a book that compiles, I guess it's about 500 pages or so of information compiling evidence and eyewitness testimonies, the work of many people over 60 or 70 years, all of it pertaining to what actually happened to Amelia Earhart, Fred Noonan, and her Electra on July 2nd, 1937. Some people think that it crashed in the ocean. Some people think that whatever happened to the plane, that she actually wound up coming back to the U.S. and living incognito as someone. And it's beginning to look like the real, I forgot to mention the Nikomororo hypothesis. And then it's beginning to look, as I was going to say, that the real story is likely to have been that she touched down on an atoll in the Marshall Islands, and the plane was slightly damaged. Fred Noonan was injured. There's eyewitness testimony of a young Pacific Islander who actually treated Noonan's head injury on board a ship. Amelia Earhart and Fred were taken to Saipan, where they eventually died. And there's a lot of detail that supports that eyewitness testimony, some of it from very highly decorated officers in the U.S. military. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. But tonight's focus is going to be the newly recovered evidence from Atoll, from Millie Atoll, that may actually finally confirm the rest of the eyewitness testimony and reports from the islanders. The bottom line, I've explained that they went off course, landed off of Millie Atoll in the Marshalls, picked up by a Japanese fishing vessel, taken to, I hope I'm saying this right, Jaluit, and then Kwajalein, and then finally to Saipan. The Electra, the airplane itself, was strapped to a Japanese ship and also hauled to Saipan, where it was hidden in a remote hangar there at the southwest end of the island, and was actually rediscovered in July of 1944 by the invading U.S. Marines. This is more eyewitness testimony. So, tonight we're talking to, as I said, Mike Campbell, but we're also welcoming for the first time on the show, Dick Spink, Richard Spink. He is a man of all seasons, a teacher, a captain, a diver, a manufacturer of premium quality aluminum boat kits for do-it-yourselfers and commercial boat builders, and he's also an Earhart researcher on his own dime, not asking for financial support from anyone else to pursue his research in the same way that Mike Campbell does. So, Dick recently collaborated on a documentary which revealed newly discovered artifacts from Millie Atoll and confirming some of the eyewitness testimony that appears in Mike's books. He also, talked to at least 2 experts in that documentary about the metal parts that he recovered. So tonight, that's pretty much what we're going to talk about, is those parts and the process for confirming that they are actually from the Electra and related to Earhart's last trip. So, gentlemen, Mike, Dick, welcome to Epic Voyages Radio.
Thank you very much, Laurel.
Good to be with you, Laurel. Thanks a lot for having us again. Really good to be with you, and thank you for all of your support and all of your concern about this Earhart thing. It's such a misunderstood piece of American history. You when you let off the show and you talked about what happened, basically that they went down on at Millie, they were picked up by the Japanese, taken to Jalawit, then to Kwajalein, then to Saipan. You talked about that as if that was a fact. In fact, it is a fact, but you are one of the very few people in the world that actually believes that as a fact. The vast majority of people in our country, especially since we're talking about one of our greatest American citizens of all time, still believes that the Earhart matter is a complete mystery and that it'll never be solved. This is the typical belief of the person on the street, if they've ever heard of her at all. Secondarily to that, if they've ever really paid any attention at all to the press and what the press is saying, they will think that she landed at Nicaragua, which you mentioned. This is the overwhelming belief that the press and the media is trying to convince people happened now since 1989 when TIGHAR made their first trip over to Nicaragua. We'll get into all that later. But again, thank you so much for having us.
Absolutely. Dick, say something about yourself and how you got into this line of research.
Well, it all started for me on a trip to the Marshall Islands when I was selling some aluminum boat kits. I was first approached by Ramsey Reimers, who has become my Marshallese brother. And I was adopted basically into the culture. I went down there to teach the youth how to build aluminum boats, my aluminum boat kits. And one of the days, when I was sitting with Ramsey, and we were at Senator Tony DeBroom's house, who's minister to the president right now, and we were talking about all the different war relics that are sunk in the lagoons in the Marshall Islands, and we were talking about different aircraft and ships, and I just happened to say, well, didn't Amelia Earhart disappear in this part of the world? And at the end of one of the tables we were sitting at was an E-Roach, a landowning king, who said, yeah, when I was a little boy, she landed on our island, and my uncle watched her for 2 days. And you can imagine, I just said, oh, right. I didn't believe him because I just thought what everybody else thought. She crashed and sank in the ocean, right? That's the story I was told. Well, after I got chewed out by Ramsey and Tony for laughing at a king, I said, well, I'm sorry, please go on, tell me the story. And that's basically where it started for me. I just heard these things from the trips that I'd made down there. This first trip I made down there was about 5.5 years ago when it wasn't on the first trip, this was probably the second trip when I heard that. And so the next time I went down, I took a video camera with me and I started recording some of these conversations. And I mean, that's how it all started for me. All I'm trying to do is just tell the Marshall Islands story. I mean, this is just part of their history. They are very good with their oral history of what has happened in the Marshall Islands. They have postage stamps with Amelia Earhart's aircraft on them, and it's just part of their history. They know that it happened. So that's basically, this was handed to me. I didn't go out searching for Amelia Earhart or anything else. I mean, like I said, 5 years ago, if you would have asked me about Amelia Earhart, I would just say something like, well, wasn't she the one that crashed and sank in the Pacific Ocean trying to fly around the world? And now, after hearing the Marshall Islands story from all these different people, and then starting to meet different researchers like Mike and Carol Dow is who I first talked to, and just talking to different people that have researched this, that have so much knowledge. I just, I started putting these basically these interviews together, and next thing you know, I organized my first expedition on Martin Daly's vessel down to Millie, and ended up, by the time it was all done, I've been down to Millie on 4 separate expeditions.
I can't even imagine what the odds are that a guy from you're in Washington State, right?
Yeah, I'm in Mount Vernon, Washington, as I teach at Mount Vernon High School.
I can't imagine what the odds are that a fellow from Washington State would happen to be over in the Marshall Islands and this specific topic would come up, and you'd have a background in aluminum parts on vessels of different kinds, and you'd find yourself doing this. I just think that's remarkably serendipitous.
Yeah, it was quite an adventure, and it still is quite an adventure. I mean, it goes on. It's just been an amazing chapter in my life. I've really enjoyed this.
Well, what do you mind telling us? First of all, I want to remind everybody that we're talking to Mike Campbell and Richard or Dick Spink about newly recovered evidence from Millie Atoll over in the Marshall Islands related to the actual disposition of Amelia Earhart's final leg of her last flight. And I believe in a little while we'll be joined by one of their colleagues who is an expert involved in connecting these artifacts with other experts and forensic analysis labs that may actually be trying to vet these. But Dick, tell us exactly what it was that you recovered, and when did you find them on Millie Atoll? And I'm sorry, I'm interrupting myself here. Something that I learned today in getting ready for this that I did not realize before, and I'm totally not educated about the atolls and the islands over in the Pacific, but Millie Atoll is actually it looks like it's almost like a bracelet. The beach itself is a bracelet, and on the outside of the bracelet is the ocean, and the inside of the bracelet is a lagoon because there was a volcano there. And when the volcano went off, what was left of the caldera filled up with water. And so it's really like a ring of beach that's around a very large central lagoon, right?
Basically, you're correct. What happened is the volcano became extinct. It collapsed back into the ocean, and the coral rate grew at the same rate that the atoll was sinking back into the ocean. And so what you've got this coral atoll, which you're right. Millie Atoll is about 50 to 60 miles across from north to south. So the lagoon is immense. And the Marshall Islands is the largest atoll nation on the planet. And there's thousands of miles in the Marshall Islands. The Marshall Islands is composed of 1 million square miles of area, yet the land mass is only about the size of Rhode Island. So land is precious there, and of the thousands of islands, there are not that many of them that are really inhabited. A lot of these still today are very uninhabited islands.
Wow. Those of you that are actually online with us in the chat room at Inception Radio Network, I am posting links and pictures, images, maps, things that will help back up some of the things that we're talking about tonight. So if you are handy to a browser, you might want to join us at inceptionradionetwork.com. Go to the chat room and take a look at some of the illustrations I'm putting up there. So, Dick, what did you find there?
What happened on the expedition when we came down? We had, like I mentioned earlier, Martin Daly of Indies Trader. He's the founder of Indies Trader. We were able to take his vessel, the Windward, from Majuro, and from Majuro on Majuro Atoll to Millie Atoll, it's about 80 miles. So we came down in two vessels, the Windward and the Trader 2, and we had a crew of about 30 people in all, with some local natives. And I had several metal detectors, and we went out in groups with picks, shovels, metal detectors, and we combed the whole island at the location where I was told exactly where she came down from the story that Juro and Lajuan told. And we basically just started combing the whole island over. And on that island, I mean, any of the islands in the Pacific, what you've got is you've just got a lot of debris that has floated up, tons and tons of shoes and medicine bottles are just everywhere. And you can see those in my documentary, all the the pings we got from the metal detectors were little metal bands on medicine bottles and little things like that would float in. And occasionally we saw some other pieces of metal that may have been from some of the people on that island that harvested the copra. Nobody on these small little islands that we set out to, there wasn't anybody there that had lived on that island outside of the people that would harvest, the natives that would harvest the copra, and that's the dried white meat in the coconut. And so anyway, we just started. Every time we get a ping, we dig it up, and we went through, and by the end of the day, the different groups, we came back in, and we had one piece that was the most interesting piece that really set me off at first, was this oval-shaped metal tag that, I didn't think too much of it to begin with. I'm not by any means a forensic airplane person that can, exactly tell you what it is I'm looking at. I had to do that once I came back. But I picked up this piece of metal. Actually, Martin Daly was the one that got the ping on this one and dug it up and brought it back to where we were, wrote down the spot where he found it. And it was the same size as an APU cover. And that's initially what we thought this piece of aluminum was an APU cover plate. And it has...
For those who are not Lockheed experts,
or
an
any
APU
aircraft
is an auxiliary power unit. Explain what is an auxiliary power unit on an airplane.
When aircraft come back in and they run a shore power cord to them, basically, I'm speaking marine here, but on an airplane, you bring a power cord over and you plug in, you keep your batteries up to charge, and everything that's inside an aircraft, it's up to a full charge on this plug that plugs in. It's like plugging an extension cord into your airplane, and this is called an auxiliary power unit plug-in. And it is an oval shaped, about the same size as this plate. So, and initially that's what we thought it was. But it would tend more, and we're right in the research of this, it would tend more to possibly be a little inspection plate of some type. The thing that makes this piece very unique is that it has the reddish-orange paint. And now this is after 77 years of fading in the sun and being on a beach and underneath coconut trees. But this paint appears to be very close, if not the same color, as Amelia Earhart's paint on her aircraft. She had red on the leading edges of her wings. And what we're doing is, in the forensic process of trying to diagnose all this, trying to get some of the original paint and doing some analysis to make sure we can try and see if this is the exact same paint.
The APU, and I've put a picture up here in the chat room so everybody can see it. It looks to me, I'm sure it's not the same size, but it looks to me a lot like a dog tag that the military guys wear around their neck.
Well, it's a bit bigger than that. Yes, okay. It's kind of the same shape as that. Okay. And you can see there's some pretty good wrinkles in it too. It's got 45-degree wrinkles across it, which is pretty consistent of what happens to airplane aluminum when it's been under severe stress. So it does have some severe wrinkles and crinks in it, and the paint is only left, it's not worn off on about half of one side of it is all the paint that's left on it, but it's enough to tell that it is a red paint. But that was the piece I brought back after the first expedition. And what became pretty interesting was there was a fairly small pile of pieces of aluminum, and I wasn't sure what was going to happen on this first trip. I mean, I was just kind of putting a bunch of things together, and hey, we're going to go out and look for Amelia Earhart, and we're going to, I was listening to some of the old people's stories, and I still wasn't absolutely 100% convinced of this whole thing yet, because I was pretty early on. And by the time we ended up getting through this and then coming back and talking to Jim Hayton, who's an incredible airplane, he's a walking encyclopedia of aircraft, and he saw in one of the photographs one of the pieces that I left behind, which is this dust cover. You have another photograph of there.
I do, and I'm getting ready to put it up there.
And now this piece is both these pieces are very consistent with what would have been on a Lockheed Electra. And this piece now is what we believe to be a dust cover off of a Goodyear air wheel. And that's what Amelia Earhart had on her aircraft, was a Goodyear air wheel. And this is one of the parts that had felt glued to the back side of it, and it kept a lot of debris from unimproved runways, because she had huge tires on that plane for unimproved runways. And this kept dirt and small rocks and pebbles out of the brake system that was on the brakes of that Goodyear air wheel. So I, of course, went back on the next expedition and retrieved that piece, brought it back, and that's when I all of a sudden realized, hey, we're really onto something here. And of course, I had a few more interviews that I had to get. And that was when I went down and I got Reverend Lajuan, the son of Lajuan that witnessed the airplane come down, when I actually got his testimony on videotape.
Well, now, since we're talking about this, I was able to take a look at that documentary that shows you doing all of this on Millie and talking with these natives and pointing to some of the other debris and photos that you took of this stuff in situ before you picked it up and collected it. And I want you at some point to talk about what looks like bicycle tires, inner tubes for bicycle tires. I know that's not what it is, but I want you to say something about that. But first of all, is there some sort of a link that people could use to take a look at that documentary?
AmeliaEarhartMovie.com is a link we've got, and you can actually buy that documentary if you want to. But that's the link that's going to be under, is AmeliaEarhartMovie.com.
Okay. Okay.
And yeah, I mean, there was just a lot of different things that we looked at and saw throughout the course of this. Like I say, this is still a whole unveil. This story is unraveling as we go. We're just more stuff is coming up all the time that we're looking at. And I'm probably going to be going down and doing another search. I mean, if we found some of these things with fairly inexpensive metal detectors and stuff, who knows? We may be going down there with Mike's getting ready to go, aren't you, Mike?
Yeah, right.
I'm getting ready to bring Mike in. Dick, I think we're having a little bit of background noise from your connection, so our producer's going to get offline with you and talk to you about that. And in the meantime, I'm going to talk to Mike. There's so many conjectures. I'm not even going to call them theories, and I went through a little list of them when we started about what happened to her.
You know what, Laurel? I think that before we get to that, okay, I think it's important for the listener to understand, okay, that nobody here is making any absolute claim that that these pieces came from Amelia Earhart's airplane. Okay, that's not what that's not what's going on here. There's a strong possibility, I believe, that it very well could be from her airplane. Because first of all, there's no records at all. There's been research done that shows that there hasn't been any recorded aircraft crashes in the area of Barre Island or Barre Island, Barre, near where the Electra came down. There is no indication that any aircraft was ever crashed in that area, which is a very strong positive sign that if it wasn't any other aircraft, then it could have been the Electra where these things came. But we are not making any smoke and gun claims here. So much more has to be done with these artifacts to determine, you know, exactly what their status is, what the chances are, what the absolute, you know, the facts are about the odds about where they came from. Okay, so that's what's going on, and that's why our friend Les Kinney, he's been working on this, trying to ascertain a little bit more about the possibilities of where, or what other planes or where else these artifacts may have come, because as we know, this story, the truth in the Earhart story, as I know so well, is absolutely hated by the mainstream media in this country. The establishment despises this. And so we have to have our ducks in a row before anybody's ever going to pay any attention to this, even if they do then. Do you understand? So that's where Les comes in, and Les has been doing a lot of looking into some of these claims. Now, when I did a story on my blog recently, I was very excited when I saw that DVD, as you were. I thought that DVD was really, for once, we have some artifacts. We have what we could call concrete proof. And then we have Jim Hayden saying that he thinks that this is the Holy Grail, and that he's almost positive that these came from the plane, and that the odds of them being from another electra are remote. All those statements may well be true. They may well be true. But that is yet to be determined. We have to go to Lockheed. These things have to go through the whole process. And that's where I think it would be helpful for Les to explain to the listeners, And
Les is online with us now, Mike. Why don't you invite him to join in with us?
Les, come on in and tell us what you found lately.
Okay. Good evening. I've been following this Earhart research for probably 30 years. I'm a retired federal agent, and I got involved in this when I was mainly the special agent in charge for U.S. Customs investigations in Honolulu. I had an opportunity to take numerous trips to the South Pacific on other missions, and mainly narcotics smuggling. But I've been interested in Earhart, and as far as the evidence that Mr. Spinks has recovered, I think in all likelihood it is, in fact, from Earhart's plane. And by that I mean maybe 90% chance. I just can't see any other rationale or any other reason why it would be from something else. There was 26 aircraft that were downed in the Millie Islands by the Japanese. In other words, 26 U.S. aircraft were downed for a variety of reasons. And none were near this island where Mr. Spinks recovered the evidence that he now has. And there's 11 Japanese aircraft that were down. And again, none were near Bari Island. So that, in keeping with what Mr. Spinks has discovered as far as the location on that island and the area where the barge might have came in, more than likely it is from Earhart's plane. And the reason I say that is, as an investigator, I'm looking back at the previous witnesses, and the witnesses are all Marshallese from the 1970s and early 80s, and they told these early researchers about this plane that landed on this particular island in Millie Atoll, and this is exact location. And it's really difficult for me to believe that these natives, or these locals, that I'd prefer to call them that, would have made these stories up when they had no relationship with one another. And they all talked about the aspect of two white people coming out of a plane and rolling to the beach, so to speak, or paddling in a little boat. And this is the exact location that they described to these researchers back in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And when you put that all together with what Mr. Spinks has found, I find it very difficult to believe that it could be possibly anything else other than Earhart's plane.
It's amazing. I've posted in our chat room a map of the Marshall Islands here, and you can clearly see down in the far right-hand bottom corner where Millie Atoll is. And if you go straight across to the west, you see Jaluit, and then you go up just a little bit. Kwajalein is in there somewhere. I can't quite spot it. And then Saipan is off the map over to the kind of to the northwest. So it's just amazing that it has taken, it's amazing to me that it's taken 70-something years for this to come to this point. Dick, are you still with us?
Oh, yes, I'm still here.
Tell us about some of the other material that you found there in that same area where you found this APU cover and the what appears to be a dust cover for the wheel, the tire.
Well, there wasn't really a lot of other things. Some of the things that didn't make sense was looked like some rigging for lifting an airplane. There was some heavy tires that were cut pretty uniquely that would have taken. They would have been cut someplace in a machine shop or something, and they were very old tires that looked like they were rigging, something used to move something heavy. And some of the other things that we came across right exactly where the airplane was loaded out were some old steel dollies that some of the old-timers there, Kachi, an old Marshallese guy whose grandmother was beheaded by the Japanese on Millie Atoll, he was telling us stories about how some of the coral was cleared away to move the shallow draft barge in, to move the airplane onto the barge. And there are still some of the old dollies there that were used extensively in areas of the Marshall Islands to move bombs around on some of the larger military installations, and there's no reason for those to be out on this little island. This is a very small little island, and here these things are sitting right where the airplane was loaded out, or what's left of them after 77 years of rust. But they're big, heavy iron wheels that run on small gauge railroad tracks, and so those are some of the rigging supplies. Of course, they're not anything to do with an aircraft, but they would be something that would be used to move that aircraft from the reef on one side at the point where they landed to around where they could get the barge in on the inside of this island. And she was closer to the outside, but there's no way in the surf that you would be able to load anything out on the outside of that coral reef. You'd have to do it on the lagoon side. And of course, that's what the old Marshallese witnesses that helped do this had reported.
I want to ask Mike a question for clarification here. I remember a story in your book where one or two witnesses reported seeing two men land in a plane or touch down in a plane, and they got in a boat that grew, a yellow boat that grew, and went through the water and came up on shore. Now, exactly what was the location where they saw that? Do you remember?
Basically, that was where Dick is talking about. That is the location off of Bar Island. Mm-hmm. They didn't call any of the islands by name at that time, but when Vincent V. Loomis went there in the mid-'80s, the early '80s, to do his research, he talked to a witness named Jororo. That's who you're talking about, Jorror, Jororo, and he was there with a witness spelled Lijon. Lee, I call it Lijon, and apparently it's called Lijuan over there, and it's spelled a little bit different way. I think we're talking about the same person.
Yes.
And these people are the two guys that saw them get out of the plane. They indicated that it was in the water because they got into a yellow boat which grew. Now, to an unsophisticated Marshallese, a yellow boat which grew is a perfect description of an inflatable life raft.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I walked that entire place many times, and I studied the tides at what they were. And at high tide, they would be in a few feet of water there, and then at low tide you could walk out even beyond that. The reef is just it's an awesome expanse, especially when you look at it from the air. And my DVD, I had some aerial shots of the size of that reef and exactly where she lands, and I've got some great photographs of it. And the reef, it is huge. The issue that's a problem is there's some pretty good coral heads that are on that reef too that would make a landing pretty difficult when you could see that would tear an airplane up pretty good coming in on that.
Mm-hmm. How large in terms of, I'm sitting here alone in my room with my hands in front of me trying to do like, well, it's like the size of a breadbasket. How big are the chunks of coral there on the beach, Dick?
Oh, the coral heads that are on that beach range in size from grapefruit size to a large majority of them watermelon size to coral heads that are 3 feet in diameter. Now those 36-inch air wheel tires that Amelia Earhart had for unimproved runways on her aircraft would easily take grapefruit size rocks up to, a watermelon size rock would throw her plane around pretty good, that she might still be able to recover from okay. But when you start getting to ones bigger than that, that's where she would have had the issue.
Wow. Les, you're still with us, right?
Yes, I am.
Can you be a little bit more specific about what kinds, if you wanted to know, if you were the judge in charge of this evidence and you said, here's what I need to know to agree that, yep, this looks like it's exactly that it belonged to at least an elector, if not her very elector, what kind of testing would have to be done to these two artifacts that Dick's found?
Well, that's a great question. The initial testing obviously would have to be whether, in fact, that the pieces that Dick has found would match those that came off of a Goodyear airwheel. And originally, we thought that maybe only the Lockheed 10, the type of plane that Earhart flew, was the only plane that had the Goodyear airwheel. But I've since determined that that's not the case. There is a variety of U.S. aircraft that would have been capable of having the Lockheed airwheel. And I got to explain a little bit more. The Lockheed airwheel means two things. One, it's the tire itself, this great, big, huge balloon tire. But it's also the same generic name as the whole generic brake system that comes down where the wheel is attached to. So that's important to understand that they're both called an airwheel. And there's a lot of U.S. planes that could have, in fact, or companies that could have purchased that airwheel. So we have to determine how many planes would have been built with that airwheel. Secondly, we have to determine if, in fact, planes were built with that airwheel, how many would have ended up in the Pacific Ocean and the Central Pacific. And so far, in the research that I've done, it's been zero. I have not been able to find any. That does not mean that that's the case, but certainly I have not come across any aircraft, and there is a variety of aircraft that could have used that airwheel. The Lockheed 10, the Lockheed 12, the Lockheed 14, and in fact, the Beechcraft company called the Beech 18, and they had a military version called the C-45, in essence could have used that airwheel. Now, whether the military had purchased those airwheels for those aircraft, I don't know, and we're attempting to find that out. Unfortunately, Lockheed's records have been destroyed, and most of the records that they had have been transferred to the University of Akron in Ohio. And I'm going through those records right now to determine, in fact, if that can take place. But I wanted to mention something else that you brought up, Laura, and that's regarding quadrant. Here's another issue that ties right in to this beyond a reasonable doubt. The kind of it's the kind of facts that I would utilize in court, and that is on Roy Moore in Kwajalein, which is nearby, and allegedly, and I'm saying using that word loosely, but allegedly Earhart was transferred from Jalute, as you described, and she was brought down to Roy Moore in Kwajalein, and then hence transferred on to Saipan by the Japanese. There is evidence that, and I have that evidence, that a suitcase was found on Roy Moore that contained the personal effects of Amelia Earhart. And that was denied by the U.S. government. It was denied by the Marines. And it was written up in Fred Garner's first book in 1966. He interviewed a Marine who discovered this in a room that had not been destroyed by the Marine bombing. And they opened up the suitcase, and it contained the personal effects, including a diary of Amelia Earhart. He turned that over to regimental intelligence, and the Marines have denied that. I have found within the last year records in the National Archives that clearly indicate that the Marines found a suitcase belonging to a confidential U.S. citizen on Roy Moore at the exact time that this witness from the Marines said he found it in 1944.
Wow. Wow. Now, why? Of course, this is something I've pestered Mike Campbell to death in the last year asking this question. Why do you think that the Marines or anyone else in the government would be working so hard to keep this a secret for this length of time?
Well, first, Mike Campbell brings up what he thinks is an answer to that, and I agree with in his book, The Truth at Last. And that is simply, in 1944, we were so engrossed in the war, FDR was still alive, and he would have known all of this going back from about 1938. And at that point in time, it would have been a thorough embarrassment to the Roosevelt administration if, in fact, it came out that Amelia Earhart was alive and that she was captured by the Japanese, and we had known about that. In other words, it would have been a secret that just could not have been exposed, because in 1944, that fall, Roosevelt was facing a very, very difficult election, and this alone would have turned that election against him. There's no question in my mind. Amelia Earhart was one of the strongest individuals in the first half of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. And if the general public would have known that America's sweetheart had been captured since 1938 by the Japanese, there is just no way that the administration at that time would allow that kind of information to escape.
That's exactly right, Les. Thank you. It's nice to hear. It's almost like listening to myself for a change. It's been so hard to convince people of this. Apparently, you're on board anyway. Good.
I want to give a plug, Mike, to your blog. It is one of the most engrossing, and I've got to say it's very active. It's a very active point counterpoint. Almost every day there are several comments posted there, and it's really heating up now that this new evidence has come forth, and especially in light of the TIGHAR claims that, and this is so funny, that they're claiming that there's this aluminum scrap that's supposed to have been the cover to a place where a window used to be. However, it's stamped with an ink that shows that the aluminum was not even made until the 40s, and she went down in 37. And then on top of that, they had brought this up in 1991, and it had been discredited by, was it Alcoa?
Yes, Alcoa.
And yet here we are in 2014, he's brought it up again like, oh, look at what we found. Forget that we found it in 1991 and that they already said this couldn't belong to that plane. It's just remarkable.
Laura, this is Les Kinney again. I'd like to mention something that the general public, and especially the TIGHAR, has gotten a tremendous amount of press, and they have a great PR team, and they send out their faxes and et cetera. But the thing that needs to be told to the general public, if they could visualize a flat island no more than 6 feet high, meaning this Gardner Island, Nukamora, as they call it today, and it's 3 miles long, and it's literally only maybe 150 yards wide at its widest point, and then can you visualize the lagoon and another 150 yards on the other side of the lagoon? And 3 U.S. aircraft, and these were opened cockpit aircraft with 2 men each in them. They flew over that island a few days after Earhart had disappeared from 500 feet at 85 miles an hour. That's very, very slow. And they cruised that island back and forth for a half hour, and they saw nothing. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that if Millie Earhart and Fred Noonan were out there, they certainly would have came out somewhere and danced around it, and they would have seen these planes and the planes that had seen her. That did not happen. That alone is proof to me that they were never on that island.
And that's just the beginning. And that's just the beginning of reasons why to believe that they were never on that island. I mean, there's a whole encyclopedia full of reasons why they were never on that island. But, you know, this idea is constantly being repackaged and resold, you know, Barnum and Bailey style to the American public. It's beyond ridiculous. It's gotten to be just a farce and a travesty. And what it really proves is how much the establishment is determined to keep the truth away from the public. Because if there was any merit to the fact, there was ever any merit to the idea that they were ever on Gardner Island, they would have already they would have already claimed the mystery is solved. If they've proved anything in 10 trips, it's that they were never there, not that they were there. If Gillespie is constantly trying to dream up some other reason to go back, and get his payday for another year. We've watched this cycle go on now for 29 years, and it's just a bit much, and it's way too much, and I get very I do get very emotional about it because I saw what it did to Thomas Devine when I first met Devine in 1990. The TIGHAR thing was just beginning to explode across the nation, and I saw how it just took everything away from Devine, who had just published his book in 1987 and was beginning to get attention, a little bit of attention from some people, but hardly anything. And then TIGHAR just swept him away. It's almost like they were placed there to discredit Devine and to just obscure Devine's eyewitness account of what he saw on Saipan, during the invasion in 1944, when he saw the Electra 3 times and he wrote the book. The reason that I even got involved with this at all, to begin with was Thomas Devine in Eyewitness, the Amelia Earhart incident.
Mike, why don't you say a little bit, describe what Devine's eyewitness testimony was, because it's pretty interesting.
Well, when Devine reached Saipan in 1944, he was not one of the initial people that stormed the island. He was not a Marine. He was an Army postal sergeant, and he was not required to go ashore until after almost the island was almost secured when he went ashore on July 6, 1944. But at that time, he was ordered to drive by his commanding officer in the Army's 244th Postal Unit. He was ordered by his commanding officer, Fritz Liebig, a lieutenant. He was only a lieutenant. It was a small unit. And they took him to Asleto Airfield. That's the Japanese name for the airport there, for their airfield. And when they got to the airfield, Devine heard a bunch of Marine officers in front of what he said was an administration building arguing about the Earhart plane and who would get credit for finding it. He was, of course, baffled by what he was seeing, and he saw then a white man in khakis, officer khakis, but without insignia, approach the group and tell them to shut up. And then he ordered them to leave the area. Devine asked another Marine. He was sitting in a Jeep, and he asked an enlisted Marine if it was true that they had found Earhart's plane. And the Marine told him, "Yes, it's true, but don't tell anybody I told you." Later on, the Marine said they would take the plane up. In other words, they would fly it. And later on that day, Devine wrote that he saw the actual the Electra in flight, and then he saw it land at Asleto. He went to Asleto again after returning there from the administration building at the airport with his commanding officer. He went back to Asleto because he was very curious. He was older than your average Army enlisted personnel at the time. He was 28, and he just couldn't be restrained. He wanted to know what was going on. He actually approached the airplane. He climbed on the wing of NR 16020. He looked inside. He saw some glass, shattered glass on the interior, and he said, this airplane was absolutely Amelia Earhart's airplane. He then saw the man that had ordered the officers. He saw him at a distance again, observing Devine and this guy, Private Anderson, who was with him. He was observing him, and Devine knew this guy was involved with this somehow, and so he left the area at that point. Later on that night, he heard an explosion. He returned to the airfield, and he saw the same plane. What he believed was the same plane in flames. Now, we have other eyewitnesses. We have other witnesses to the destruction of the Electra at Asleto Field.
That I can't even imagine what that must have felt like to someone. Especially, I had not remembered reading that he actually touched the plane and got up on the wing and looked into the cockpit. I mean, to know that's what it was, and it had been hiding there all this time, and then the next time you look, it's on fire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and so Devine, when he returned from the war, figured that this was all going to be explained, and he also had another experience before returning to the States on Saipan, because he was retained on Saipan after all the the victory was won and the island was secured. There was what they call a garrison force that stayed on Saipan. That also supported of course, the bombers that were attacking the Japanese mainland from Tinian and also from Saipan at that time. And Devine right before Devine was supposed to leave Saipan for the States in August of 1945. But first of all, he was shown what he believed was the grave site of Amelia Earhart by an Okinawan woman who said it was the grave site of a white man and a white woman who came from the sky. And then the day that Devine was supposed to go back to the States on a ship, he was told by another man in khaki, in insignia, and not officer insignia, but without insignia. In other words, what Devine thought was an intelligence-type person on Saipan to board an airplane. He was told to board an airplane for Hawaii because he knew about Amelia Earhart. He was told to do this, and he was scared, and he refused to do it. He would not go on that airplane, and he feels that if he would have ever gone on that airplane, that he might not have ever landed safely anywhere.
Wow. Go ahead.
This is one of the tangential aspects to Devine's story that to me makes it so realistic. But to the skeptics, they just throw all this out. They think this is all ridiculous, that he dreamed all this up. That this is all just part of a conspiracy plot. But to me, knowing him as I did, he didn't have very much imagination at all. I mean, he really had very little because he had such a problem with the Marshall Islands idea and other things. He really had no imagination. There's no way in the world he made any of this up.
And the sad thing is that just because of the passage of time, so many of these individuals that are quoted in your book and Fred Garner's book, they're dead. There's not many left of the first-hand eyewitnesses, right?
That's right.
Right. All the GIs are dead as far as I know. There might be one or two that, if they're not dead, they're in their mid-90s and they're very, they're just they're not in good shape.
Yeah. Laurel, let's kind of fill in a little bit here for the listeners from Millie Atoll to Saipan, because that's quite a story in itself. In between, now you mentioned that her plane and they were picked up by a Japanese fishing vessel. Well, it wasn't a Japanese fishing vessel. The name of the boat was the Koshu Maru, and it was actually a U.S. built boat that ended up in Japan, being in the Japanese military, and it was a Japanese seaplane tender.
Oh, okay.
Now, at the time.
But Dick, we do have evidence that they were picked up. There is evidence that they were picked up by a fishing boat first and then transferred to the Koshu. That's what she was referring to.
Okay. But when, say, Billaman Amran, who is the medic, saw Fred Noonan treated the wounds on his forehead and his leg, that was aboard the Koshu Maru, which was the vessel that took the boat, all the way from basically Millie to Jalut, up the chain to Quaj, and then eventually to Saipan.
And do I remember reading that at some point in that trip between Millie and at least Kwajalein, that the Japanese were sort of treating this as a march of honor, that look who we got. We found the American female pilot, and she's safe, and we have her, and we're taking care of her. But it seems like I've remembered reading, Mike, either in your book or maybe seeing it in some blog, that in the very beginning, they thought, well, this is great. They found her and she's safe. And then all of a sudden, she just fell down a rabbit hole.
Let me respond to that if I can. This is
okay,
go ahead, Les, because that leaves me kind of cold. That doesn't ring a bell.
You're right, Laura. And in fact, that's a point that's intriguing to me, and and I'm still intrigued by it, and I'm actually doing some research and investigation on that. My thoughts on this are this, and it's strictly bureaucratic. When she was lost, And then she was found by the Japanese. At that point in time, the Japanese had not formulated any sort of plan or idea what would happen if, in fact, Earhart was discovered in the Marshall Islands. So when she did land on Millie Atoll and she was picked up, and it's alleged that she was picked up by a fishing boat. I don't think anybody has any concrete or positive information that she was really picked up by a fishing boat. She certainly was picked up by the Japanese, and she was transported, as we know, back to Jeolu. But if she was picked up by a fishing boat, regardless, at that point in time, and you can visualize the kind of things that are happening in Washington, D.C. today, there was no plan formulated. There was no PR. And nobody knew exactly what was going to occur. Well, obviously, there would have been a radio message sent from Jeolu to Tokyo indicating we picked up this American aviatrix, Amelia Earhart. And everybody would have said, whoa, wait, and cheering, and so to speak. And with that said, and this is the point that you were trying to make.
Yeah, right. That's right. I'm sorry.
This actually hit the Japanese press, and it was in a Japanese newspaper, one of the leading newspapers in Tokyo, that Amelia Earhart, the famous American flyer, was rescued by us, meaning the Japanese. And this was sent out, and this was actually written in a news article, I believe on July 12th, 1937, the fact that they found Amelia Earhart in the Marshall Islands. Within a day and a half, they retracted that article and said that was a mistake. It did not occur. And that's where the point that you were trying to make there. Originally, it was all cheers, and supposedly people were cheering on the streets of Tokyo the fact that they found Amelia Earhart. And then it was quietly discounted and said that that didn't occur. That is something that I'm looking at, and I'm trying to get a hold of that particular newspaper from July 12, 1937, to see, in fact, exactly what they wrote. And that message somehow was transmitted by wire to the Japanese embassy in London. And they, in turn, also apparently had discussed this. And it's very confusing. But quietly, Japanese diplomats decided that there's no way that we're going to tell the rest of the world that we had got her, meaning that they might have thought she was a spy or whatever. I don't know.
Right.
But at that point in time, they discounted all this information and they denied everything about it.
So, see, there's still quite a bit of the story that truly is a mystery, and part of a mystery that we'll probably never have the whole answer to because there's no one left to confirm it or disconfirm whatever hypotheses we come up with. Les and Dick and Mike, we've got to take a break for about 2-3 minutes, something like that. I'm hoping you'll stick around with me for the next hour, and we're going to open up the line for questions. I'll give that number out, so I hope you can stick around. Are you willing to do that?
I'll be here.
Sure.
Okay. Wonderful. Wonderful. So let's take a break. You're listening to Epic Voyages Radio here on Inception Radio Network, and we'll be right back. Well, welcome back, everyone, to Epic Voyages Radio here on Inception Radio Network. We are having a very lively discussion between Mike Campbell, the author of Amelia Earhart, The Truth at Last, and Richard Spink, who has recently brought back to the U.S. for analysis some new artifacts that have been recovered in the part of Millie Atoll in the Marshall Islands where we believe, I'm going to include me in that group because I've done some homework and reading, and I agree with these guys, that Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan touched down for the last time on July 2nd of 1937, and eventually were taken by the Japanese to Saipan, where probably at least Fred was beheaded, executed by the Japanese, and Amelia may have been too, or she may have contracted dysentery and died not that long after Fred was executed. So that's what we're talking about tonight. And in the time that we spent off air here, we were talking about some of the other tantalizing details in the story. Let me read the telephone number for anyone out there who would like to join the discussion. You can dial up 888-919-2355, or of course you can go to the chat room at Inception Radio Network and type a question into the chat room. You can also go to Skype to Inception Radio Network and type in a question there to our producer, Joe. We're going to be talking, I think, for the next 40, 50 minutes about what happened after Amelia and Fred Noonan were taken to Saipan. One thing before we leave Millie Atoll, though, there's a tantalizing detail about, and Mike, you're going to have to help me with this. One of the native eyewitnesses said that he witnessed the two people coming on land from this downed aircraft, and one of them had something that looked like a little valise or a small case of some sort, and went over to a tree and buried it.
Well,
go ahead.
Okay. Laurel, let's be precise. For anybody that's actually got my book, it's on page 144. Okay, so it's in there, and I'm going to read a little bit of it. It says, Lorock was one of the two witnesses that saw the Earhart plane come down off of Bar Island. Lorock was 11 years old, living on Millie, when he heard Lejean tell his story. Lijuan is how Dick Spink says it now, and so that's what it'll be. Lijuan, was out fishing in the lagoon near Bar when he saw this big silver plane coming. Lorock told Nags. Now, this is Oliver Nags, a South African investigator who was over there in Millie in the very early 1980s. It was low down. This is what Lorock said. It was low down, and he could tell it was in trouble because it made no noise. Then it landed on the water next to the small island. He pulled in his fishing line and went quickly to see if he could help. When he got there, he saw these are strange people, and one is a woman. He watched as they buried something in the coral under a canal tree. He could tell the man was hurt because he was limping and there was blood on his face, and the woman was helping him. He waited there in his hiding place until he saw the Japanese coming, and then he left. Later, we were told the people who crashed were Americans. Later on, Barry goes back and searches those areas and finds a large rotting trunk of a tree that could have been a canal tree, and there was also a small canal growing nearby, according to Nags. The metal detector found a hard knot of soil that appeared to be growing at the root of the tree. Cutting into it, we discovered a mass of rust and what looked like a hinge of sorts. Not believing the shapeless lump could have once been the metal canister buried by the American flyers, Nags chipped away at his find but uncovered nothing more. But he took it back to South Africa. It was analyzed by the metallurgical department of the University of Cape Town, and the results confirmed that in section the sample revealed what is described as a pin cover, rivet, and body of the hinge. In general, the microstructures are consistent with a fine, clean, low-carbon steel, indicating that good technology was used in its manufacture. Nags regretted not bringing the entire mass back for analysis, but the hinge, quote, could have come from something akin to a cash box and could therefore quite easily be the canister to which Lijuan had referred. And then in Earhart's book, Last Flight, she actually talks about the tin case that Fred had purchased. I believe it was in South Africa. I'm not sure. Somewhere along the way, he had purchased this tin case, and she talked about it rattling. So that's what we think it was.
And I guess they thought maybe he had money in it, or...
Well, she thought he might have had a little bottle of booze in there. She sort of hinted at that. Okay. But personal stuff, you know. Mm-hmm. So that's what else could it have been? I mean, to me, I did a whole blog on this, and there's a picture of it. Actually, I have a picture of the piece that was that Nags put in his book that was analyzed. It doesn't look like anything. You can't recognize it as being a hinge. Apparently, the soil over there is really, Dick would know better, really nasty to anything that's buried under there.
Yeah, it is. It's tough to dig through, too, without tearing things apart real easy. I mean, the way that, a coconut tree grows full growth in less than 20 years, and they just wrap their roots around everything. So it's pretty tough.
Wow. When we were talking during the break, Les, we were talking about the trail of blood from the marshals to Saipan, and what actually may have become of Amelia and Fred. Do you want to pick up where we were talking and say a little bit about that?
Well, sure. This is one of the best parts of this mystery, and it's actually almost something out of a movie script. And that there are, as Mike indicates in his book, there are numerous witnesses in the in Saipan that saw a white Caucasian woman and a white man, and they didn't initially describe them as Americans, but they said that they were white, and they saw them being in the custody of the Japanese. And the stories are a little bit varied, but they're in consensus in the sense that they're in custody and that they're near the jail, the Garapan jail in Saipan, and they might have been there for a lengthy period of time. And as memories fade, some of these witnesses said that they might have been there for a short time. Some said they thought they might have been there for a lengthy period of time. But there's no doubt they're talking about the same individuals. And what's really interesting about this is that they all met their demise. Nguyen allegedly was beheaded, and shortly after, either Amelia Earhart or this white woman died of dysentery, and or she was beheaded as well. And that's it. However, here's where the story gets great. In 1944, and I have this date down, in July 22nd, 1944, two young Marines from the 18th Marine Engineering Battalion were ordered by a Marine captain who was an intelligence captain. His name was Tracy Griswold. He said, "Accompany me. I want you to help me with a little job." And the next morning they left with him, and he drove around, and they eventually ended up on the outskirts of a remote native cemetery. And he had a map. And he told them, "You guys go this way, and I'll go this way. And when you see an area that looks like a fresh grave of some sort, let me know." And one of them found that grave, or he thought was potentially a grave. And he said, "What about here, Captain?" And the captain said, looks at his map. "Yeah, this looks like it's it." And he had these guys start digging. And as they dug down to about their waist level, one of them calls up, "Captain, what are we doing here?" And the captain looks down at them and said, "Have you ever heard about Amelia Earhart?" And they said, "Of course. Keep digging." They eventually came up with the remains of two individual skeletons, or skeletal remains. Unfortunately, they didn't clearly identify how much of the skeletal remains remained, other than the fact that there was a sizable amount of bones, and in one account, they even indicated that there was some possible tissue that was still attached to the bones. Well, the captain took that material, put it in some sort of a canister, and they left. And as you know, Laura, in Fred Gorner's book, he clearly documents this. And he had talked to this captain who was involved in it at the time, and he had denied this. His name was Tracy Griswold out of Erie, Pennsylvania. And he became somewhat friends with Fred Gorner, and they basically agreed that I'm not the man. And Gorner was probably convinced that Tracy Griswold was telling the truth. The two Marines told an entirely different story. They hadn't seen each other in 20-some years, and they were interviewed separately by Gorner and later by a group from Cleveland, Ohio, and it was clear that Tracy Griswold was the one. They actually had photos of him in a police type of photo lineup. And they said, "This is the man who told us to dig up this particular grave, and these are the bones that we dug up. And we gave them to him, and we never saw this man again." And that was the beginning of that particular part of this Amelia Earhart saga. And it goes on from there, because those are bones, when they came back, nobody knows what happened to them. And the bones were actually redug up again, little remnants of the bones at that same gravesite, by a group from Cleveland, Ohio in 1968. And when they brought those bones back to the United States, anthropologists said they're clearly, at least in his opinion anyway, and it was just his opinion, that they're from a white man and a white woman, and that they're partially cremated. With the advent of DNA, about 9 years later, these same guys from Cleveland went back to the anthropologists to retrieve those bones to now have it tested for DNA. Unfortunately, the anthropologist had died, and the bones had disappeared from the Ohio Historical Museum. It's a fascinating topic.
Gosh, you're reminding me of the stories that I'm familiar with about the remains of giants that were excavated around North America in the 1800s, and either Carnegie Mellon or the Smithsonian came and said, "Oh, this is wonderful. We're going to take them back and analyze them, and we'll get back to you." And now they say, "We don't know what you're talking about. We never took any remains back."
It's very similar. Very
Yeah.
similar.
Well, what you're describing, this reminds me of, I'm telling you folks, there's so many tantalizing details in Mike's book. And gosh, if I had time to go all the way back to Fred Garner's book and start from there, it would probably be even more instructional. But Mike, in your blog recently, you published a story about Amelia's mother and a letter she sent to, I think it was it Netta Snook, the woman who taught Amelia how to fly?
Yes.
And she's talking about how her tone, and I encourage people to go to Mike's blog, and I put the links up here. It's www.earharttruth.com, and look for the letter from
No,
Amy.
actually, Laurel, it's earharttruth.wordpress.com.
Oh, okay. I thought the link went to the same. Go ahead.
Well, you can get there from the website, but the actual blog site is https://earharttruth.wordpress.com, or you can go to earharttruth.com and click on blog.
Okay. Well, I'll finish the gist of the story, but Mike has the details on it. It sounds as if Amelia Earhart's mother really believed that she was picked up by the Japanese, taken to Saipan, and initially they thought that she would be sent home and she'd be okay, and that never happened. And I was left almost with the feeling, Mike, that maybe someone made a deal with her that if we give you her remains so that you can put her to rest, will you please shut up about this and not bring it up anymore? Now react to that.
Anything is possible. What else can I? This letter that Amy Earhart wrote to Netta Snook is so full of not only information that's likely accurate, it's also full of information that might not be accurate at all. And so it really takes some real study, and the letter can be deconstructed in so many different ways. In fact, when you said that she said that Amy Otis Earhart was Amelia's mother, mm-hmm. and she never, in her letter to Netta Snook, never wrote the word Saipan. She never said that Amelia was taken to Saipan. She only said that she knew that the Japs had her and tortured and murdered our brave flyers. I'm quoting now. You know, Netta, up to the time the Japs tortured and murdered our brave flyers. I hope for Amelia's return. But she never says Saipan. And she also says that Amelia sent SOSs, an SOS, after she went down in the Marshalls. This ties in with less strong belief in what they call the post-loss signals, the post-loss Earhart
transmissions.
Yes, and which is, if she landed on dry land, she would have been able to send radio signals. Now, other people, such as Paul Rafford, a radio expert from Pan Am in the early days, who was a really smart about radio, and he wrote a book too called Amelia Earhart's Radio. And Rafford doesn't believe she had enough power in her radio to reach hardly anywhere. So there's different opinions. This is a very controversial topic of, in this saga, is the post-loss radio. There was so many different ones. They couldn't have all been true. But I don't know. I don't know what to say. Some sound very, very interesting. Les might want to talk some about that.
Wasn't there a teenage girl in Florida who claimed that she heard her transmission saying
yes, that's the TIGHAR thing. That comes from the other side, and that's
true
that's
or not?
Real crackpot stuff. That's real. That doesn't even deserve to be discussed. I don't.
So that hasn't really been documented. That's just a claim.
Only by TIGHAR that I know of. There's many other ones that are much more credible, more credible than that. Les, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, what do you have to say about the radio transmissions?
Well, first of all, I want to comment on what you mentioned, Laura, and I think you're spot on. I've always wondered about the aspect of Amelia's mother, and throughout the late 30s into the mid-40s, into 1947, 48, 49, she was adamant that Amelia, her daughter, had been captured by the Japanese, and all of a sudden she changed. And I agree with you. And of course, there's nothing to back up what I'm saying. But more than likely, and this is my thought because I'm a retired federal agent and I was a high-level manager of a government agency. And that's the sort of thing that would have occurred. Somebody eventually would have said, we have to say something to her. And the idea of the government returning her bones and allowing that to be a quiet burial somewhere in Massachusetts, it rings true to me. So for what you just mentioned, I think that there's might be some truth to that. We'll never be able to prove it. Mm-hmm. And therefore, then Amy would have been satisfied that her daughter had rightfully come back to the United States and was now at peace. So with that in mind, I believe that. I really think that's a plausible answer.
Mm-hmm. This could also explain why Muriel never made a whole lot of noise about it either. Or
Muriel was her sister.
Yes, that's correct.
And in fact, in 1963, when Amelia Earhart realized that Tom Devine was going to go over to Saipan and possibly into Tokyo as well to research and to find out what happened to Amelia Earhart, Amelia's sister wrote a letter to the U.S. ambassador in Tokyo, said, I'm going to give you, quote, a heads up, and that's my term, not hers. There is going to be people coming over here to investigate Amelia Earhart. I want to let you know that they're coming. And she writes, and I have a copy of this letter, by the way, and she writes this letter in such a way that you would think that she knew exactly what happened to her sister. And she was now satisfied and at peace with it. But she was warning the U.S. government officials that there's going to be some nosy researchers coming around, and that she had.
She couldn't have been talking about Devine, Les. She couldn't have been talking about Devine. He never went to Japan.
No, he didn't. But he had written letters at that point in time, and he was in the press.
He had written letters to Michiko Sugita in the mid-'70s. She was in Tokyo.
Well, I'm just telling you that from the stuff that I have, Mike, and I have this.
I know.
Letter.
Well, you've been holding out on me, Les. I didn't know anything about this letter.
Mike, we live to surprise you.
See, this is inside researchers' baseball here, you know. And so Les has been holding out. I didn't know that. I just surmised that somebody might have told Muriel about this, the same way that somebody might have told Amy Earhart about it, because they just didn't want them.
I agree with that. Because she wrote this letter to the U.S. ambassador over there in 1963, giving them a heads up, and to the fact that there was going to be people investigating her sister again. And it was written, as I said, in just a manner that you'd kind of wonder, well, why would she be doing this? And it's the kind of a person who's in the know, and now she's satisfied. So, Laura, I think your thoughts are right on, and there's probably some validity to it.
It's just my little Scorpio hunch, you know.
It's good. Good.
Now, Eleanor Roosevelt was a very close friend of Amelia's, right?
Yes.
Could she have played a role in trying to get information to Amelia's mother?
I'll respond. I'm not quite sure she was as close as what people have written about her.
Okay.
Was a friend. I got maybe through the National Archives and through the FDR Library in Hyde Park about 25 or 30 letters of correspondence between Amelia Earhart and Eleanor Roosevelt. And it was a congenial personal relationship. I don't know whether they were that terribly close. They certainly were close. Could Eleanor Roosevelt have inside information and pass it on or whisper it to other people about what was happening or what she knew? That's possible. But you got to understand, if you're a historian of that era, that Eleanor Roosevelt did not have that close of a personal relationship of what her husband was doing when he was the president of the United States.
Right.
And you have to take a look at that, because he had only a very small circle of friends, and she was not one of the people that he was intimate with as far as imparting personal knowledge.
Yeah, she would have had to stumble on something if she had found it out, right?
Yes, and no doubt that if she found out something independently, or if there was some other aide or associate of her husband's that whispered something to her, she would have come running through the back door to her husband and said, what about this? And then he in turn would have been truthful to her. There's no question about that. But he would not have given her information of this type, knowing who she was and the fact that she was a champion of women's rights long before the women's rights was a movement. So I don't know whether Eleanor Roosevelt, unless somebody whispered her in the ear, and there's no question that could have happened, And then she would have pressured her husband into having some sort of a response that she would have some knowledge herself. But I'm not sure of that.
So for right now, we're going to let that stay in the category of conjecture.
I think so.
What was I going to ask you? It was a really good question, too. I'll think of it in a minute. That's why I like to take notes. I don't have my pen in my hand. So someone in the chat room is talking about how Amelia used to go by the nickname of Millie, and it reminds me of the Islanders hearing or talking about Melia, and someone overheard it.
No, it was
Biliman Amram that overheard the Japanese on board the Koshu referencing her, Mia.
Oh, Mia.
When he was treating the scar on Fred Noonan's forehead and his knee. And that's where that name came from.
Okay, now that's a different... I'm sorry, Dick. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to bring up the point about, Bilamon, and he was probably one of the best eyewitnesses at the time that came out of the Marshalls, the best probably that came out of the Marshalls, and that was when the ship, the Koshu Maru, was at Jalyut. And on my DVD, Charlie Dominic, his Uncle Tamaki was on the refueling crew of that boat, and he gives a pretty good description of the story from Bilamon. And Bilamon was a very, very reputable person in the Marshall Islands up until his death in the 90s. He was a very prominent citizen there that did a lot of good things for the community, very well respected. And, there's just no way this guy would have made that story up. I mean, it's just the way he tells it is.
And he was interviewed by a lot of people, beginning with Gerner in 1975. Les says that he has the tape of that interview, actually, which is something I was never able to get my hands on. Les is an incredible researcher. He does all kind of incredible work. Bill Primack in 1989 was one of the last people to interview Bilamon, and Bilamon said that they called the Japanese crewmen on board the Koshu. Actually, Bilamon didn't say Koshu, but just Japanese ship. But he said they called the lady Melia, Meelya, Melia. That was what Bilamon told Primack.
And I want to make sure the listeners understand that when these guys are talking about Bilamon, he was basically an EMT. He was a medic that was brought on board to treat the injuries that Fred Noonan had, right?
That's right. He was half Japanese, half Marshallese. Mm-hmm. Was fluent in Marshallese and Japanese, and it was a corpsman at that time. And you had to really have your stuff together. He was a very smart young man.
Wow. I found my pen and I made my note, guys, and I remember what I was going to ask you about. There's a lot of debate over, and this relates back to the radio transmissions before the plane touched down somewhere. There's a lot of debate over whether Amelia, was possibly not really accidentally lost, but kind of cruising around and looking from a bird's eye view of what was going on as if she was reconnoitering. And I know this is probably all conjecture, but it seems crazy to me that she had a navigator on board with her who knew Morse code, even though she was not what I would say fluent in Morse code. But, I mean, how could they have possibly gotten lost and gone for hours without making radio contact, and they only stayed online long enough to say a few things, but not long enough for the Itasca, which was the U.S. carrier that was trying to track them. They couldn't even get a fix on them because they didn't stay on the radio long enough. Do you think it's possible that that Amelia and Fred were actually kind of flying around poking their nose in something, and the Japanese, that's part of why they thought maybe they were spying on them?
This is the huge mystery. This is the real mystery of the Earhart matter. This is the real mystery. What was she doing, and why did she land at Millie? Okay, and the other stuff is all just smoke and mirrors about what happened to her. And the mystery is, and we still don't know. So go ahead, Les. I know Les has some very definite ideas on that.
Well, I don't know. And Laura, to your point, conjecture is probably the proper term. There's a strong evidence, the fact that she might have been potentially what you'd call involved in a great intelligence mission, as she was not. And the rationale behind it, of course, is that you're right. How could Fred Noonan become off course by 2, 3, 4, 5, 600 miles? It seems implausible. The only island that she could have possibly wanted to take a look at would have been Truk. And Truk was considered the Gibraltar of the Pacific, and it was an area that was an enigma for the United States. We knew nothing about it. We really flat knew nothing about it. And I'd seen intelligence reports. We were desperately trying to find information about Truk as early as 1927, 28, 29, and we knew very little. But we did know from radio transmissions that it was a large Japanese naval installation. So,
Les, I want to interrupt you for just a second and tell you that I've read recently that Truk was considered the Pearl Harbor of the Japanese. It was. Is that right?
Yes. Well, well, yes and no. I mean,
it was that big an installation for them in
terms
it was
of their
huge.
Navy. Yeah, the Truk Lagoon is huge and it's deep, and so therefore it could actually have accommodated as many as 50 to 60 ocean-going naval ships at a time. We didn't know that. We had no idea. We did not know what was there. And would we have wanted to have known? Absolutely, because we were making attempts to know what was going on in the mandated islands as early as in the late 20s. But getting back to the original story here is that if Earhart was going to take a look, the only way she could have done that was before dark. And granted, people will say that they could have thrown out these, what they call these burst balloons, where they would have had these flashlights and then it would have been lightened up and that she then could have taken photographs. I think that is highly implausible. She wasn't technically feasible, and it would have required equipment that everybody would have seen on board her plane. So the only thing she could have done was try to reach some place before dark and snap some photos just to satisfy the U.S. Navy that, in fact, that place might have been fortified. And Truk Lagoon would have been it. And she would have gone over Truk if, in fact, she was on some sort of spy mission around 6:30 to 7 p.m. that evening prior to her being lost. Did that occur? I don't know. Nobody knows. But she did operate a radio in such a manner that makes you wonder why she got lost. None of her transmissions were more than 10 seconds. They were short bursts. And it would have been impossible for anybody to take a fix on her, including the Japanese. So was she forewarned that if she transmitted in long, lengthy sentences, that the Japanese would have known exactly where she was at? That's possible that she would have been told that. So, there is that theory that she was on a spy mission, and it's a plausible theory. I don't have any information on that.
Someone in the chat room is asking, was her radio in her airplane unfamiliar or new to her?
No.
Mike, you want to answer that?
I'm not a radio expert, but I know it. But she was never reputed to be very good with radio. But I wouldn't say that it was new or unfamiliar to her. She had been at least using it since her first attempt. Since they first began in March of 1937, if not earlier. She was used to the radio. She didn't like using the radio. She had a reputation as being kind of loosey goosey with the radio. But no, I wouldn't say she was unfamiliar with it either.
I agree with that. I agree with Mike's statement. She had been using this radio for several months, so there's no question. It's not just anecdotal, but there's a lot of eyewitnesses stated that she only had a rudimentary knowledge of Morse code. And the general listener today, the people listening to your broadcast tonight, that's not the kind of broadcasting that had occurred on that airplane. And people have to understand that in that time, in 1937, any sort of logical, reasonable transmission of an official nature would have been done by Morse code. It would not have been done by voice. And she was almost unfamiliar with Morse code. Supposedly she had a rudimentary knowledge, and maybe she could transmit 4, 5, 6, 8 words a minute, but it doesn't seem even that it could have been done. She just did not have any knowledge of that. And Noonan admitted that he was also very unfamiliar with Morse code.
And they announced before they even started that all the radio communications would be in voice. That was the plan.
Yeah.
Well, they had agreed upon frequencies, and she kind of didn't follow along with what the agreed upon frequencies were supposed to be.
No,
too.
the communications was a disaster. They were never on the same pages. Some people say that they had different understandings of the frequencies that were going to be used, and the times were all messed up. William Galton, one of the radio men on board the Itasca, told Paul Rafford that he sent Amelia at least 50 messages on the frequencies which were agreed to, 3105 and 6210. Not one of his messages was responded to. I mean, it was just a disaster. She acted the whole time as if she really didn't want to talk to anybody. It was so bizarre as to be just off the charts. Her behavior was completely it didn't make sense at all for somebody trying to find a little speck of land in the middle of the Pacific that had never been done before. That flight had never been made before. No, something else was going on. We just don't know what. I
don't remember who it is in your blog, Mike, who made the comments about her behavior on the radio, but he pointed out, if you're a pilot and you're out in the middle of nowhere, Pacific Ocean, and you've only got so much fuel and you're well aware of that, and you think you're off course, the last thing you're going to do is come on to the radio for 10 seconds and then turn it off for 6 hours. You're going to be saying, find me, here I am, can anybody hear my voice? And you're not going to put the radio down until someone answers.
In that chapter where we talk about the final flight in Truth at Last, I take a lot of Bill Primack's first-person commentary. He was a great researcher. He produced incredible newsletters during his time, 1989 to 2000. And Bill Primack was a pilot. He talked about the time that he almost went down, that he was lost, and he said that he stayed glued to that radio the whole time. He was afraid for his life, and that's the radio was his life. And so he maydayed and whatever he needed to do to let the Coast Guard, whoever was down there, to know, he did. Everything that she didn't do.
Let me give out our phone number again in case anybody would like to dial in. We've only got about 20 minutes left, not quite. 888-919-2355. Your chance to talk one-on-one with Mike Campbell, Richard Spink, and Les Kinney about the real story about Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan's last flight. Here's a question for you. Someone in the chat room is wondering if she was really all that good a pilot. Did she really know what she was doing flying the Electra? Can any of you make a reply to that?
I'll let Les or Dick do that.
Well, there's no question that she wasn't the greatest pilot in the world. At the same time, Fred Noonan swore by her. He said anybody who could fly, and this is prior to the flight being finished, by the way, the last flight, that anybody could fly the way she did. And her own personal trainer, Paul Mantz, said the same thing, that she was a good pilot. Charles Lindbergh made a statement one time, and he said this, quote, he says, Amelia Earhart made a good landing once. And then he went on. Of course, it was a joke. It was at a dinner of some sort. But she had to be a good pilot to do what she attempted to accomplish. There's no question about that. Was she the best pilot? No, of course not. And was she a little bit rough on the controls? Must have been, because she had a very hard landing when she landed in Miami just at the beginning of her world flight, where it cracked up that back window that TIGHAR is now assuming that was covered over by aluminum. But she was a good pilot.
And she crashed on takeoff from Luke Field, too. Let's not forget that.
Yeah, she crashed
on takeoff from Luke
Field.
Yeah,
that's in Hawaii, right?
The reason she did that, according to Paul Mantz, Jim Hayton, who's a guy that's helped me out a lot here, he knew Paul Mantz and talked on the telephone several times to Paul Mantz. And Paul Mantz had told Jim that Amelia was not a very well, during her takeoff, she had a rough time. She would tend to chase, instead of using her rudder, she would tend to chase the airplane straight with the throttles, which ended up one of the reasons she looped the plane on the ground at Luke Field when she was taking off on her first attempt around the world. So, I mean, there's a lot of people that say some people say she was great. A lot of other people say, oh, no, she wasn't that good. And, I mean, she had guts. That woman had guts.
That's the main thing.
That's
she was
right.
brave. There was no one braver. There's no question about
Absolutely.
that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Was she the greatest pilot? No, she wasn't the greatest pilot, but she certainly wasn't the worst. That's for sure.
The story of her solo flight across the Atlantic in 1932 is an amazing story. She didn't have Fred Noonan with her then. She was all alone, and she went across the Atlantic. She was the second person in history to do it. That's right. That's what made her star.
That's right.
Do any of you happen to have any idea of how many hours in flight she had logged by the time she was on this final flight?
Not a clue.
I think that I read somewhere that it was not that much. It was something like 2,500 to 3,000 hours, something of that nature.
Okay.
When she flew, she flew for a purpose, and she flew for a reason. She didn't have an overwhelming amount of flight time. I read in another female aviator's book that she had something like, meaning the aviator who wrote the book, about 11,000 hours, and then Amelia Earhart had about half of that. And she was a close personal friend. So she did not have an overwhelming amount of hours. One thing that has to be brought out regarding her flying ability, and this has been written out twice, and I heard it twice. Once from somebody, or Paul Manson wrote, and then somebody else wrote, that she had a tendency to drift left when she was flying. And if that's the case, if she was flying from Lae, New Guinea to Holland and she was drifting left, well, that would make it, she would be heading towards an area that she would intersect up in the Marshall Islands. It's possible. And she wasn't the greatest pilot, but she was a good pilot. No question about that.
Well, she missed Dakar. She, on her trip across the Atlantic on that same flight, she drifted left 150 miles. She missed Dakar by 150 miles to the north on the same flight.
Wow.
And we know from the weather patterns of July 2nd, 1932, she called in on one radio transmission they did get. She was 1,000 feet. She was underneath a cloud cover, and the Itasca was sitting in clear blue sky in the water at Howland Island. The weather was worse to the northwest.
So that gives us another hint of how she was off course. Les, in relation to the Marshall Islands and where Howland is and where she was coming from New Guinea, where would Truk be? Truk Atoll.
Truk is definitely to the left. She would have had to leave Lae, New Guinea, and actually maybe go about 15 degrees left or west in order to hit up the Truk, and then she would have went on a line. Sort of diagonally from Truk, heading back down towards Howland Island. And
the trip would have been 3,200 miles. It would have been 3,200 miles if she went to Truk.
Yeah.
And she wouldn't have had enough gas for that, right?
Well, theoretically she would. Theoretically, it was 4,000 miles max. But that's only theoretically. Probably not.
Yeah.
That's another reason why.
A lot of pilots will tell you that, as you know, if you're a pilot, and I'm not a pilot, but if you're a pilot and she's starting off with a full load, and if she's able to have any sort of prevailing winds, and if she went towards Truk, she would have had prevailing winds. And at that point in time, that would have helped her out. But as the fuel is dispensed, the plane lightens, and all of a sudden she was, if there's one thing she was excellent at, and it was noted, she was excellent at conserving fuel. And everybody knew that. And she was really, really good at manipulating the fuel. And consequently, there is a possibility. If she could have flown 4,000 miles, she certainly would have been able to do exactly what she wanted to do.
And Truk would have been in line with her drifting to the left as a matter of habit.
Well, she would have had to purposely go there.
Deliberately, yeah. Mike's right. She would have definitely deliberately have gone to Truk and then swung around and heading back towards her destination point of Holland.
Interesting.
But that's all speculation.
Well, we've got about, I'm going to say about 10 or 12 minutes left before we're going to have to close this up. So let me go to each one of you one at a time and Dick, you've been very quiet this hour, so we're going to start with you and take a couple of minutes and just kind of summarize your viewpoint and where we are with this and what needs to be done next to answer all these questions.
Well, what I've got are the pieces that I picked up through my different expeditions. And what I'm doing right now is I am I'm having these pieces scanned. I'm in the process of it right now, especially the one dust cover, because it's been very disformed from the crash. And what I'm doing is building an electronic 3D model of this part, scanning it, and then it's going to be flattened and then reshaped. The electronic model, not the piece, the electronic model, so we can make an exact duplicate of what that piece was originally shaped at, and match that with whatever records that we can find from the Goodyear airwheel. And as far as the other little plate that we thought that may have first been an APU plate cover, what we're doing is we're looking at other L10s and seeing what they have for inspection plates. Most of the inspection plates we've seen have been a little bit bigger, not the same size as this one. However, when her plane was in Miami, there was different work done with the antennas and such, and this could have easily been a little cover to put over an antenna plate or something, and just a little inspection port on the wing, in the front or on the rear. We don't, who knows? So what we're trying to do is just take care of that, and we're going to also analyze the paint that is on that little cover. So I've definitely got my work cut out for me. I would have probably been on a little bit faster, but I've kind of drained a lot of my funds so far on these trips that I've made to the Marshall Islands.
Plus, you've got a regular day job teaching school.
Well, I got a couple different jobs that I do with selling my boat kits around the globe. So it keeps me quite busy. But the story, the way it was just placed into my to my lap, I didn't go out there, as I mentioned in the first hour. I didn't go out looking for this story. This story found me and came to me, and I'm telling it for the people of the Marshall Islands. And I know so many people there. They're family now, and they all tell me the stories of Billimon. And it was great getting to know Reverend Lajuan this year, whose father was actually a witness to the landing. So it's really a fantastic country, and Martin Daly has done a ton to help. I mean, if it wasn't for Martin Daly and the Indies Trader to help us do what we did down there, we probably wouldn't have what we have. So that's basically where I am with this right now. With time and money, I'm trying to put it all together.
And you're going to be updating all of us inquiring minds, so to speak.
Oh,
you're
absolutely.
Going to be updating us on the blog, or how will we know when you've stumbled on it?
I'm always in touch with Mike and Les. Okay. Les just, he lives in Olympia, which is not too far from me. He's only an hour and a half drive away from me here. So I've actually been able to meet Les a couple of times so far, and that's been great. And everybody that's involved in the whole line of thought of Amelia Earhart like we are, they've all been in touch with me. And I just want to be someone who is here trying to get everybody that's on this same line together, to pull everything together and make this happen. I mean, this is going to be a team effort of everybody that is following the truth to what happened, and it's going to take us all.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I really applaud that attitude, and I know that all three of you have that attitude. I want to make sure Amelia Earhart movie.
AmeliaEarhartMovie.com, and you can kind of follow a little bit of what I've done at AmeliaEarhartMovie.com. Carol Dow was the one that helped me with that. She's the one that I was able to first get a hold of, for one of the first ones that
okay,
answered.
Dave, I'm on the phone yet.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Anyway,
I don't know what that was.
I don't know what that was either, but anyway.
I guess that's your cue.
I guess there you go.
Well, Dick, I really appreciate so much you're taking the time to be online with us tonight, and it's just an absolute fascinating story. Every piece of it, every piece that I hear that's brand new, my jaw drops a little lower. So,
well, it's been fascinating to me. You can't imagine when the old man at the end of the table, when I said, "Didn't Amelia Earhart land in this part of the world?" And he looked right at me and said, "Yeah, she landed on our island, and my uncle watched her for 2 days." And I looked right at him like, "Yeah, right."
Wow. Yeah, I think there's a little bit of serendipity going on there for you.
Yeah, that's where it started for me.
Well, Mike and Les, who wants to go next? I'll leave it up to you. Who's going to toss the coin?
I'll go first here, Mike. First of all, Laura, I want to commend you. You have a very, very good working knowledge of this Earhart mystery, and I commend you for that. And it's spot on as far as I'm concerned.
I'm a groupie.
Yes. As far as what's going on, Dick's evidence is there's no doubt it's paramount to corroborating the belief that Earhart was captured by the Japanese. There's no question to it. And Dick needs to determine whether, in fact, the evidence that he has, those two pieces, come off of her plane. And I think we can do that. I really believe that. And the thing that I'm so intrigued about is the fact that the luggage that was found on Roy Moore in 1944, it belonged to Millie Earhart. There's no question about that. And I have that documented in evidence that was found in secret Marine files, and I have it with me. And lastly, if we could possibly take it from that point and jump over to Saipan and re-unearth that grave site where she was buried, and that the bones were last removed in 1968. That was the second time they were removed. But there should be a few pieces, small remnants of bones that were missed, simply because it was a very, very amateur dig.
And maybe some clothing.
I doubt it. They would have possibly got that at the time. Now, there was no evidence of clothing. However, in the original digging in 1944, it was something that was overlooked because of, these guys are talking from 30 years memory. But yes, there's a chance that could have occurred. But if we now could find just even a small couple pieces of bone and have it analyzed by DNA, and I'm thinking about going back over there in March to do just that.
Wow.
And all of this, none of this could be done, of course, unless the publicity generated by Mike's book, and that's and he's spot on. His book is the Bible. He's done a great, credible job in telling this story and telling it factually and in an unbiased manner, and I believe it. And with all of that, I think we're going to solve this. I really believe that.
I've just got a question. Is there some kind of funding organization, or is there any grant money, even if it's small, like a couple of $100,000, that would support some kind of a startup to go over there and do what you're describing?
Are you serious, Laurel?
I don't know. Yeah, no, not to my knowledge. Anybody who's ever attempted to do something, because there's been a couple of guys that have gone over with the Kickstart internet site to try to raise money.
The funding sites.
I have not. I thought about that. I thought about it. All of this, I know that Dick has spent his own money on it. I've gone around the United States interviewing a lot of old men and trying to gather evidence, and it's all my money. I've not asked, and it's something that probably we should cooperate on, and I think Mike would agree to that as well.
Well, in my follow-up email tonight, I'm going to toss a couple of ideas out there to the three of you, and we'll keep in touch on that, okay?
That sounds great. And
I'm not saying I have any answers, but I've got all kinds of wild ideas, so we'll see where we wind up with it. Les, thank you so much for taking the time tonight and joining us, and I hope I get to talk to you again before too much longer, and we have like a gala celebration with the evidence turning out to corroborate everything we've been talking about.
Thank you,
Laurel. Can I jump in for a second?
It's your turn, Mike. It's your turn. We have like 5 minutes.
Okay. Well, I don't know if I'm going to hog all that, but you just asked the question about grant money to find out the truth about what this is. Anathema to the establishment. Okay. This story. This is where my real expertise is. It's the cultural attitude about the truth in the Earhart case. If the cultural attitude of 77 years of government propaganda was not such as it is, there wouldn't be a story anymore. It would have been solved a long time ago. We wouldn't be sitting here talking. There wouldn't be only people like Fred Gerner, Thomas Devine, Vincent V. Loomis, a handful of others, myself, doing books about this subject. The establishment despises this story. This is the point of all of it, okay? That's why Les and I and Dick are doing what we're doing, because they guard this. This is a sacred cow. I titled a chapter in my book, The Care and Nurture of a Sacred Cow. The truth about what happened to her remains a sacred cow to this day. That's the whole problem. I think it's, there's just no doubt about that. If there was, when I first met Thomas Devine, I in 1990, I said, how come the New York Times or Washington Post, everybody in the world is pounding down your door for your story? I didn't understand it at that time. He just looked at me and shook his head. He didn't know. But I know now. I learned soon enough why. They don't want the story. I've been rejected by thousands. You are one of the rare few people in this country that will put the truth about the Earhart matter on the air. Believe me, I know. I have a list of them on my site, and there's not many, and they're all independent types that aren't bought and sold by the networks and owned by special interests. Only the independent people with courage will put this story on the air. I mean, I could tell you from now until tomorrow, I could tell you stories about how people have told me they're interested in this. Oh, this is fascinating. Once they find out the ugly details about what happened to her on Saipan and how our government covered it up, and FDR is being protected to this day, they want nothing to do with it. And they're not even polite enough to tell me that. They just ignore me. They just blow me off. I mean, it's the story of my life. And Les, I don't know if I'm letting a secret out. Les is writing a book. Les intends to have a book. And when his book comes out, he'll find out the same thing that I found out. He'll experience the same thing.
How about what the Office of Historical Preservation did to me last week?
What was
That's
that?
a whole other story, too. The United States government, through the Office of Historical Preservation, through the United States Consulate in Madro, wanted to know what I'd found.
So, go ahead and tell them, Dick.
I don't know that much about it yet. All I know is that as things started coming out about my discoveries, all of a sudden the United States government wants to find out what it is I've got.
I didn't want to mention that unless you did.
Well, it's just something that's coming out. It's going along the same line as what's happened to you, Mike. So, yeah. This is just happening to me. Hey, I'm a newbie in this. I'm just beginning to figure it out. But I know that it's part of the story.
My general rule is it's always better to throw bright light on things than to let it sit in the shade, because too many times things that stay in the shadows never come back out again. So unless you've got a real good reason to keep something a secret, I think it's probably smart for you to bring it up and mention it.
Well, the Marshallese government is behind me all the way up. They know that I'm doing this for them, and they are standing behind me solidly.
Well, I can't tell you.
It's not a secret in the Marshall Islands. They don't have anything to hide.
It's not.
They have stamps commemorating it, for goodness sake.
That's right. That's right. And President Christopher Loak, who's the current president now, I've worked with him on this. He knows what's going on. He's a great guy.
I'm going to have to step in. My producers just told me we are flat out of time. So I hate it, but I mean, I think that's probably a compliment, considering I don't think anybody stopped to take a really deep breath since we started. Everybody, be sure to join us next week. Dr. Aaron Judkins is going to be here. I'm not sure who his guest is. John Capello will be here on the 29th with the Vedic astrologer, talking about what's coming up in 2015. And check our schedule on epicvoyagers.com if you want to see what else is coming up. Thank you again, Les and Dick and Mike, and I'll be looking forward to hearing more from you. And everybody out there, stick with us next week. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Laurel.